It is Transfiguration Sunday this weekend. The story of the time when Jesus took three of his disciples up on a mountaintop, and for one brief moment, they got a glimpse of who he really was as the Son of God, God Himself, radiating glory. We always celebrate the Day of Transfiguration right before Lent starts. The 40-day Lenten season begins this year on Wednesday. This coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and the 40 days of Lent culminate, of course, with the Feast of Good Friday and the Feast of the Lord's Resurrection, Easter Sunday, which this year is going to be in the middle of April. So we began our Lenten journey this week on Wednesday. Lent is Lent. The word Lent literally means spring. There's nothing fancy about that particular word. The season of the church year in Lent is all about reflecting upon Christ's sacrifice for us, His becoming humanity, His becoming weak as a human being, so that we may become strong as children of God. And to help prepare us for this journey into the depths of suffering and death, we have this moment before Lent begins where we are given a glimpse of the glory that awaits. It's always a little bit easier to go through a valley if you know that you're going to be coming out the top on the other side. And this was a moment here, even though the disciples, it didn't completely register for them at the time. Years later, Peter would write about this. In fact, our epistle reading in church Sunday is Peter writing about this and looking at this particular moment as a strengthening of faith so that we would be willing to endure everything. And Peter says, hey, all the stuff that we're telling you guys, it sounds pretty fancy. It might even sound fanciful. It might even sound too good to be true, but hey, listen, we're not lying to you guys. We are not following cleverly devised myths here. And Peter says, we saw this. We here referring to just three guys, him and James and John. But he's saying we saw on the mountaintop who Jesus really is. And as a result of seeing this, and then as a result of seeing him risen from the dead, we know that whatever happens, whatever valleys we are made to endure, that we're going to come out more than okay on the other side. So the Transfiguration is really an opportunity to have joy and to have comfort in knowing that no matter what happens, we will be restored to a position of glory with Christ. So let's talk a little bit about the story itself. And again, actually, this being Transfiguration Sunday, this is why we moved the Sunday school lesson so it matches up with the right Sunday in the church here. This will be a focus of our worship. I have decided to preach on the Old Testament text. I certainly will be discussing what happened with Jesus and the disciples. But my sermon is mostly going to be centered on what happened in Exodus on a different occasion when God summoned some people to a holy mountain. I'm going to look at some of the similarities there. I guess you won't be exploring that Exodus story all that much in Sunday school. But just a heads up that the worship in the Sunday school lesson will match up. We're commemorating the same event in both. And this gospel text from Matthew 17, which you guys are having for your lessons this week, that is the gospel reading in church tomorrow. So let's delve into it. So it begins with Jesus taking these three disciples up to the mountain. Why these three? I don't know. These are the three that were really the inner circle of the disciples. Peter, James, and John. Because James and John were brothers. So the three of them are up on the mountain and they have no idea, what they're in for. Much of following Jesus for the disciples meant just kind of going with whatever he said. Hey, that's kind of like our experience, right? We don't know what day to day necessarily, what high points or low points are coming. We don't always see them coming around the bend. Sometimes they blindside us, for better, for worse in our lives. We just trust God that He's got a path charted for us and we're going to follow that path. So in this case, it meant going up a mountain. And they go up the mountain and immediately Jesus is transformed before them. Maybe I guess we do use the word transfigured and not transformed, because to transform means to take on some other kind of, like a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. And it's not so much that Jesus is changing here. It's just that the people now can see how he always is. His glory has been hidden to this point for the disciples. So that's why we call it a transfiguration and not a transformation. So Jesus is transfigured before them. They see him in a different way, but a way that he actually always has been. And it's this blinding, glorious sight as they behold Jesus on the mountain. And then we get a cameo appearance. Surprise guest stars, Moses and Elijah. Hey guys, what have you been up to lately? I'm just hanging out in heaven. And now here we are. So, Moses and Elijah. You would not expect to see these figures. Moses died a long, long time ago and was incidentally buried in a mountain. This is not the first time Moses has been on a mountain with the glory of God. We'll be talking about that on Sunday. I'll be talking about that anyway during the sermon. And then Elijah, well, maybe not a shock that he's there because he never died. Elijah, one of the two figures in the Old Testament, along with Enoch, who never actually died a mortal death. Elijah just poof went off into heaven. But now they're both here on the mountain. Why are they here? Well, it doesn't say in the text, and there's been a lot of ink spilled over the years in speculating why these two figures are on the mountain. But the simplest explanation, and the one that most people agree with, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Actually, you know how we kind of divide the Bible into the Old Testament and New Testament? Well, in the Old Testament, they kind of divided the Bible actually into three sections. There's the law, the prophets, and then the writings is what it was called. The law was referring specifically to the first 5 books of the Bible, kind of centered on the law that God had given through Moses, the 10 Commandments, but actually in a larger sense, all of the words that God spoke about how to live as his people in the world. The prophets would refer to, well, think of like the back half of the Old Testament, all of those books that are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Habakkuk, Nahum, Jonah, all those guys, well, leading up to Malachi, those are all prophets. Well, Lamentations is not a prophet. That was written by Jeremiah. But anyway, the prophets, and then the writings would have referred to what we sometimes call the wisdom literature today, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. So, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the different books of the Old Testament. In fact, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, he literally says that. He says that he is the fulfillment of the law, the prophets, and he says the Psalms. So here we have, though, Moses, representative of the law. I mean, he's always kind of the stand-in for the law because he's the one who got the 10 Commandments up on the mountaintop. He's the one that proclaimed the law to the children of Israel. So Moses is kind of the shorthand for the law. And then Elijah kind of stands out among the prophets. He was the one who didn't die after all. He was the one who had the task of calling out the Baal worshippers on Mount Carmel. So Elijah is a stand-in for all of the prophets here, is at least how a lot of people look at this. And so Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, and what are they doing up on the mountain? They are actually not standing with Jesus. They are looking to Jesus. And Jesus is speaking with Moses and Elijah. And then that's where Peter makes one of the mistakes he does. Peter errs on the side of talking, and he doesn't quite know what's going on, but he says, Lord, it's good to be here. Let's build 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. There are 2 things wrong with what Peter says here. First of all, the notion that this is now going to be Jesus' home along with Moses and Elijah is problematic because this does not fit into God's plan for where Jesus is going to live, where Jesus is going to dwell. Jesus has not come in order to set up a permanent shelter for himself on a mountaintop. Jesus has come to die. Jesus has come to suffer. Jesus has come to carry and die on a cross. Of quite the opposite from what Peter is proposing here, right? So this is kind of like when the time when Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." If you remember that particular time, Peter was telling Jesus, "No, you will never suffer and die." Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." You know, Peter is speaking a kind of a temptation here to Jesus to avoid the cross, and Jesus says, "No, that's not why I've come." So the cross here is what awaits Jesus, and not a special shelter. But also the notion that Elijah and Moses and Jesus are all on the same level here. This is also an offensive statement that Peter is making. Jesus is not just added to the pantheon here. Jesus is above Moses and Elijah. To this day, this is why we have the liturgical tradition of standing for the gospel reading. The Old Testament, the Psalm, the epistle reading, these are God's words. But the gospel reading is about the life of Jesus, and we stand for the gospel because we honor Jesus as the top of the line here when it comes to God's word and God's representatives here on earth. Nobody compares to Jesus. He is the Son of God. And so we stand for the gospel, and well, Peter didn't actually stand, right? Peter ended up with his face on the ground when the voice from heaven spoke. And Peter and the disciples are terrified when they hear this voice. I imagine if we heard the voice of God today, thundering down from heaven, it would be a rather terrifying proposition, especially if the voice was contradicting something we had just blurted out. I mean, yeah, none of us like to be publicly reprimanded. We've all had it happen where we say something stupid in a crowd and then someone points out that we just said something stupid. That doesn't feel really good. But imagine God pointing out that you said something stupid. Like, okay, is there going to be consequences for this? So the disciples, they fall on their face, and then all of a sudden, just as quickly as this all began, it's over. And Jesus is touching them and encouraging them to get up and telling them not to be afraid. Do not fear. So you're going to live to speak another day, guys. You're going to live to bear witness to what you have seen here today, so that when people encounter the valleys, they know that there is a crown waiting for them, a glory that will be theirs on the other end. Let's see, what else do we need to cover here? What were they talking about? Matthew doesn't tell us what Jesus and Moses and Elijah were talking about, but Luke does. So in another gospel account, we get that they're talking about what has to happen in Jerusalem. The Lent that is coming, the suffering that is coming. This was actually a discussion amongst the three of them. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are discussing the upcoming passion, the upcoming suffering that Jesus will be made to endure. And then as we're going down the mountain, so this is not included in your text that you're going to be teaching the Sunday school kids because it's a perhaps potentially confusing whole separate conversation. But I personally think it's fascinating in Matthew 17. And this isn't going to be part of the church reading either. But as they're going down the mountain, the disciples ask Jesus. Let's see, let me get out my text here. Well, actually, one thing that's, before we get to that, the very end of verse 9, tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. So Jesus calls his resurrection right here, even though they didn't totally understand it at the time. And then verse 10, which is not in your lesson, but the disciples asked him, then why do the scribes say that Elijah must come? So what they're really asking there, at the end of the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi, Malachi says that before the day of the Lord, Elijah will come. Now, of course, Elijah didn't die, so people are expecting Elijah to come back. And now, whoa, lo and behold, up on the mountain, there's Elijah. So what the disciples are saying here is like, does this mean what we think it means? The day of the Lord, the day of healing and restoration, the day of judgment, the day that sin is removed, the day that Israel's glory is restored. Is this the day that's coming soon? Because we just saw Elijah. And Jesus' answer is kind of interesting. He's like, the day is coming. It's coming very soon. But that seeing Elijah on the mountain wasn't your tip-off. You should have seen Elijah come already. And here he's referring to John the Baptist, who literally dressed exactly like Elijah. and perform the same prophetic function as Elijah on the banks of the Jordan River. So John was the Elijah that Malachi was actually prophesying to. Just a little bit of an aside, may potentially confusing, so that's why all of a sudden we got to start talking about John the Baptist here, and it's probably too much to focus on in one Sunday school lesson. But just so you know, that happened. That exchange took place, and the disciples once again were given this statement that the day of the Lord is in fact coming soon, and it still is. We're actually still waiting for the full culmination of the day of the Lord, but because of the events that happened shortly after this Transfiguration Day, we are guaranteed that the day of the Lord is in fact still to come. Jesus has died and Jesus has risen. Now we know Jesus is coming again. All right, well, let's talk about some of the takeaways from this. What does this story tell us about who God is and his mercies? Well, actually, to be frank, and I'm going to be talking about this some in the sermon, this one story by itself actually doesn't reveal anything about God's mercies. Sorry. It actually reveals God's fearsomeness, God's unpredictability, God's power, and our place of humility before the almighty throne of God. So the story doesn't reveal much about God's mercies, but it does reveal much about God's power and God's might. And it reveals to us who Jesus is as the Son of the Almighty God. What does the story tell us about who we are as God's people? Well, it does reveal to us, I guess again, not this text by itself, but the future glory that does await God's people. So knowing that Jesus is truly the transfigured, glorious Son of God is what enables us to behold the cross and recognize that this is not the end of the story. And recognizing the glory that awaits all who are baptized into Christ, all who belong to Christ, well, this is what allows us to persevere through difficulties. So this story can be a particularly powerful one when it comes to suffering in this world and recognizing that God has given us a glimpse of what awaits that permits us to have perseverance no matter what valleys we're going down to. We can't stay on the mountain, but not yet anyway, but we're headed to the mountain. And then finally, how does the story tell us about how to live? Well, actually, there is one very clear directive from the Word of God himself, from his voice itself. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. So this tells us who Jesus is, this voice of God, and God also tells us what we should do every day. Listen to Jesus. Listen to his words. Now, you have a wonderful opportunity in Sunday school to proclaim the words of Jesus to the kids. You have a wonderful opportunity when you gather for worship on Sundays to hear those words for yourself. And yes, they are commands and words of law, but also Jesus gives the words of grace, the words of forgiveness of sins. Listen to those words. Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood." Listen to those words. Regularly listen to the words of Jesus and you will not go wrong. Go through life listening to Jesus, not just hearing, but listening. And all things will work out for you, no matter what crosses you carry. All things will work out and you will be put on a mountaintop. You will be eventually given a chance to not only see the glory of God, but you yourself will radiate his glory. You are the light of the world. When you hear the words of the light of the world, when you hear the words of Jesus, when you listen to him, you become glorified yourself. And although the world right now, just like the world couldn't see Jesus' glory except for that brief moment on the mountaintop, the world cannot always see the glory of God radiating in our frail, weak human bodies. But the time is coming when it will, when the world will behold the unveiling of the children of God. Paul writes about this in his epistle, how the creation itself is longing to see the glory that's going to be revealed in us. It's Romans chapter 8. Check that out if you'd like. It's a wonderful passage. This transfiguration of Jesus is pointing ahead to a glory that's coming for all of us. A great, great story as we get ready to head to some difficult times in the life of Jesus and continue to go through difficult times in our life, never forget that glory awaits.